During World War II, the Nazis slaughtered 6 million Jews, half of them women and children. When a nation suffers such merciless slaughter, the hope for life becomes overwhelming. Every year on Holocaust Memorial Day, Israel remembers. So does Shanghai.
The Jewish people will never forget what the people of China and the people of Shanghai did for us, and we will always be grateful for that.
This is a ceremony in memory of the 6 million Jews who were killed by the Nazis. It's a story about 6 ordinary people from 6 countries: Czech, Poland, Greece, France, and others. They saved many Jews from fascist persecution. Though they passed away many years ago, the gratitude felt for them is everlasting.
I think there's importance in holding this kind of ceremonies, specifically here in Shanghai, because of the mutual history of Shanghai and the Jews in World War II, and the fact that the Jews were saved here, in Shanghai. It's important for us to share it. It's important for us to remember.
People's commemoration of the Holocaust isn't limited to just one day or just one method.
We remember very, very well how the Chinese government in Shanghai practically saved 20,000 Jews from the hands of Nazi Germany.
Ruth drove for 2 hours to attend this exhibition in Jerusalem. It displays paintings showing Jews' life in Shanghai during the war. Witnesses like Ruth are becoming older and fewer. Those who lived in the Shanghai Ghetto remember very clearly, however.
No, there were no fences like this. There was no border. We had streets. We were told,
not to.
On this street you cannot go from one sidewalk to the other sidewalk.
The word ghetto referred to a restricted area for Jewish refugees. In Chinese, it was translated as Gedu, which means an isolated town. It's a vivid reminder of the isolated and controlled life of Jews in Shanghai at that time. Because of wartime restrictions, there were very few reports about the Shanghai Ghetto in those days. An increasing number of people now know that Shanghai was a haven for Jews during World War II. But only a few know about the Shanghai Ghetto. The real picture of the Shanghai Ghetto could be buried with the elderly survivors.
There was no fence. We lived together with the Chinese within what we had. We were free to do what we wanted, so we had the club, and we had 2 restaurants, and we had the most wonderful bakery. God, was that good.
Ruth was living in the designated area, which included Jiaofeng Road, Muirhead Road, and Dent Lane on the west. The east boundary was Yangshupu Road, the southeast Seward Road and Wayside Road, and the international settlement boundary to the north. The Shanghai Ghetto was not walled, but invisible walls were everywhere. The occupying Japanese army regarded Jews who arrived in Shanghai after 1938 as stateless refugees, since they had been stripped of their nationality by Nazi Germany. The Japanese authorities ordered these refugees to relocate to the Shanghai Ghetto or face severe punishment.
Many thousands of people trying to crowd into the small area. So with much difficulty we found one very small room on Chuzan Road, where they have the house where I lived has a plaque?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that house.
All right.
In that house, in the back, there was a little wooden shed, a little wooden box almost, and that was a room. And my father, my sister, and I moved into that room.
The Blumenthal family moved from downtown Weihai Road to the restricted area within the time limit set. Michael Blumenthal later became the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. Betty's family lived just 10 meters away at 52 Zhoushan Road. They moved in before the deadline too, May 18, 1943.
On our floor, every room was taken up by one family with all their belongings. We had our suitcases stacked up one over the other in the corner, and we had a couch. My parents slept on the couch. My sister and I slept on 2 camp beds.
Ruth's family moved from Kunming Road to the neighborhood of Hoshan Park. Some 100,000 poor Chinese and 20,000 Jewish refugees lived within this area, less than 2 square kilometers. The ghetto was crowded, squalid, and short of food and clothes. Compared to the living conditions when the Jewish refugees had arrived in Shanghai, this was much worse.
Because I got lice. They jumped. And then they used to open up their jackets and take them out and ate them.
Ate them?
Ate them.
Epidemic diseases like smallpox, malaria, plague, and typhoid fever were rampant within the ghetto. Once an epidemic of typhoid fever broke out, and soon 300 to 400 people were infected. But refugees were afraid to go to the hospital since the sanitary conditions there were even worse. Moreover, it was extremely difficult to apply for medicines because they were controlled by the Japanese.
Both his wife and him were doctors, Dr. Zucker. And when I got typhoid, he came to treat me at home in Waterloo. And he said, I will not send your daughter to a hospital. She will never come out. So my parents were sitting by my bed, each one 12 hours every day and night to take care of me. And Dr. Zucker came every day to take care of me. And I remember we didn't have any money anymore, you know, and I needed medication from the Concession Française. And so Papa said, I will get you the medicine. So what he did, he went on Waterloo and he sold his watch. I will never forget it. To get me his medicine. That is what parents do. But this one never forgets.
The August 9, 1943 edition of the Shanghai Jewish Chronicle carried this announcement. From August 10th, refugees without special permission shall not be allowed to leave the designated area. Any violation of this rule will be seriously punished. The feeling of imprisonment evoked thoughts of the Nazis that were hidden at the bottom of their hearts. It was horrifying.
Is this? Those are the Japanese, aren't they?
Yes, the person who issues the pass.
Goya.
Goya. You know him?
Don't.
In this painting, Jewish refugees are applying for passes to leave the ghetto. It was the only way to the city beyond the boundaries. Goya, the Japanese Ruth mentioned, was the man who issued the passes.
Goya, he was a kind of a crazy man. Sometimes he was very nice. Sometimes he was not nice. He would yell at people and say, go away. He was a very short man. He really hated tall people. Sometimes a tall refugee would come and say he wanted to pass, and Mr. Goya would get up on top of his desk and slap the person.
He used to stand on this desk and say, I am the king of the Jews, because he was so short and he didn't like tall people.
Horrible thing that happened to them. And if they didn't get slapped, they saw someone who got slapped. Or if they didn't see someone who got slapped, they heard about someone who got slapped. And they all talk about Goya and his brutality.
This is a statement written by a Chinese fruit seller for his Jewish client. I herewith confirm that Mr. Posner is buying regularly all kinds of fruits at my stall in the Hongqiu market. Shanghai, June 28, 1944. If Jewish refugees wanted to work outside the ghetto, they had to apply for a pass, and a statement like this had to be provided to make the application. Even children who attended schools outside the ghetto area had to apply for it.
He would beat people up sometimes, and if they didn't talk the way he wanted them to, he would put them in jail behind him, and that was like a death sentence. And I was always afraid to go and get the pass, you know, to leave the ghetto and come back by 3 o'clock. But my father usually came with us, and I felt safer when he was there, although he was scared too, he told me later.
The loss of freedom, the trampling of dignity, and the lack of food and medicine cast a shadow of death over the ghetto.
My grandmother died in March of 1943. She was 74 years old.
I have an uncle who passed away, my mother's brother, her youngest brother. I think he was 31 years old. And my grandmother, a couple of days later, on her birthday, passed away as well, because he happened to have been the favorite child of hers. But it was difficult. Food was not plentiful. There was disease. It was a difficult time.
Cries often broke the silence of the night in the streets of the ghetto. Some died of disease, some committed suicide. The war was still on. Chinese and Jewish refugees living in the ghetto started to share secrets. Some refugees helped the Chinese to fight against the Japanese. Some made bombs. However, if caught, the penalties were harsh.
One man that all the refugees knew about was arrested because he was thought to be in the resistance, and he was beaten very badly by the Japanese. And then he was put in jail, he was beaten very badly by the Japanese, and then they just left him on the street.
In fact, Chinese living in the area were even worse off than the Jews.
Badly, very bad. They treated the Chinese people worse than they treated us. When you cross the bridge, Garden Bridge, you know, the Garden Bridge across the Suzhou Creek, Chinese people walked by there. There was a Japanese guard standing on Garden Bridge. They had to bow. Every Chinese went by had to bow before a Japanese soldier.
They were terrible, terrible to the Chinese. And we could see that. They were very bad to the Chinese, and we always felt sorry for the Chinese who could not really do anything about it.
Living at 96 Huashan Lu is an old gentleman who was the neighbor of many Jews. Now at the age of 92, he is hospitalized. For the Chinese, those days in the Shanghai Ghetto were also heartrending. Mr. Chen contacted volunteers from the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum, hoping that they could help record the lives and stories of the Jews he remembers. He tells us what Shanghai people of the time thought about their Jewish neighbors. Mr. Chen says life was very hard, full of illness and food shortages. But the Chinese and the Jews helped each other get through the difficult days.
习惯了做生意啊，他们做什么生意呢？ 做裁缝也有，做木匠也有，做仪式上也有，那么做理发店也有，都有做生意的。前面画一排是后面画位，所以外国人是很勤俭的，不管你什么生意都要做。中国人做生意也不管，他们做生意也不管，做各回各做。
Evelyn's mother was one of the hard-working Jews that Mr. Tran remembers.
She took the path to get out of the ghetto, and she went into the city proper, I don't know which section of the city of Shanghai, and she bought up things like belts, sunglasses, scarves, small things, and she put them into the toolbox, bring it back into the ghetto. She'd give it to the peddlers on Tongshan Road, and they would sell whatever, and it didn't bring in much money, but it put us about half a step above starvation level, I guess.
In the fall of 1943, 2 years after her family arrived, Betty drew a card for her father's 50th birthday. The 8-paneled cartoon showed Betty's father's life, his birth, his marriage, and their days from Germany to Shanghai. The last is a family portrait, a family of 4 with nobody left behind. The 13-year-old girl put her heart into drawing a place that was 8,000 miles away from Berlin, their new home in Shanghai. In 1944, a growing number of Jewish teenagers stopped going to school. Instead, they were trying to make money to buy food.
So I got the job of delivering the bread to the people for 2-3 hours in the morning, and for that I got an extra half a loaf. So now I had 1 full loaf, 2 halves, 1 whole. And I could exchange, I could sell the half a loaf for something else, for some vegetable or some eggs or for something else to eat, or cigarettes or something. So that was my way of earning a little more money.
The Oil Moishe Synagogue became the refugees' spiritual home and sustenance. They held gatherings here to pray for an early end to the war. But the situation continued to worsen. Then came the winter of 1944. The refugees had sold their heavy clothes in the summer to buy food, so they were short of food and garments at wintertime. Many died of hunger, cold, and disease. Being isolated in the ghetto, the Jewish refugees struggled with hunger, disease, and death. They endured life this way for 3 years. Until one day in the summer of 1945, the bread delivery boy, Michael Blumenthal, suddenly found that the Japanese guards had disappeared.
The Japanese soldiers were gone all of a sudden. They weren't around anymore. They were hiding. I don't know where they were. So it's really over, it's really over. And then we heard on the radio, and within a few days, the first airplane arrived with some British and American advance guard coming to talk to us, bring food and so forth.
Well, it was very quiet out there. All the Japanese had disappeared. And we realized then, we found out through the radio that the war was over. And it was a sense of freedom, definitely. Singing, dancing, kissing everybody, you know, being happy.
Happy, very happy. One big party, never, non-stop party.
On August 15th, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. The Jewish refugees were free again. They thought it was time to go back home. They could not wait to contact their friends and relatives. But then terrible news began arriving.
We started hearing about our relatives who had been killed in Germany.
They all got murdered. My mother figured between 60 to 80 members of our extended family got murdered.
Nearly all of them, except for 2 or 3, were murdered by the Nazis in the camps and the ghettos of Europe. After the age of 9, I never had grandparents or uncles and aunts anymore, except for 1 or 2.
However, on the opposite side of death is birth. Records show that over 400 Jewish babies were born in Shanghai during the war. Shanghai babies. Sonia is one of them. Even today, Shanghai is the place of birth shown on her passport.
If someone look at my passport, even if I came to Shanghai at the airport, those Chinese soldiers are looking at my passport. They see Shanghai, they watch me, and I show them that I have no Chinese eyes, and then they smile. There are my
In March 1939, Sonia was not yet born. Her pregnant mother arrived in Shanghai after a month at sea and gave birth to Sonia in October. The now 76-year-old Sonia is very famous among Jewish refugees in Germany. In the last 15 years, she's been organizing a name list of Jewish refugees in Shanghai.
I'll try to find him in our list, but you told me already years old. In 1944, I found 56 people with the same name, Schlesinger. And you told me that
Sonia has put together a detailed e-document that lists the family information of over 14,000 people. She typed it in all by herself.
From the very beginning, the original list was in my hands. I got a very deep feeling, because all the names I have seen, there were some people, they died already, and they woke up in front of my eyes. And I was very much excited.
Based on Sonia's list, the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum built this memorial wall. It was unveiled on September 2014. There are 13,732 names on the wall. Decades passed. Sonia's list finally provided a clear proof of this history.
Most of them are very, very happy and thankful, most of them. For example, I've got emails from a professor from France, and he went to the Shanghai Jewish Museum and he has seen the wall, and he asked me to use the names.
Because of missing historical data, it might be impossible ever to find out the complete name list of Shanghai's Jewish refugees. But one thing is certain. What seemed the worst choice at the beginning turned out to be the key to their survival.
Look at this picture. And this woman is Betty, and she just fled from Nazi-dominated areas to Shanghai in 1939. And at that time, she was a really young girl.
After the Japanese surrender, those who survived were full of passion for a new life. In 1948, when Betty was working for the U.S. Navy in Shanghai, she met a handsome young man at a swimming pool.
I walked into the swimming pool, and I had long red hair at the time, and my husband liked red hair. So he offered to teach me how to dive. Well, I wasn't a very good swimmer, but I said, of course, because he was very handsome, so I decided I would. And I didn't drown that day, and we got together very quickly.
The Jewish girl who fled to Shanghai to save her life found her love in the city after 10 years of life in exile. An identical wedding photo is preserved by Betty's son, Peter, who lives with his family in New Jersey in the U.S. It's on a chest that Betty bought before she left China. The Chinese-style cabinet is now a treasure for Betty's family.
And it has now become a family heirloom, which you're not allowed to sell it.
No, I'm very proud to have that.
In February 2015, Michael Blumenthal returned to Shanghai for the 8th time, and again he visited the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. In 1973, as the president of the National Committee on United States-China Relations, Michael Blumenthal led a delegation to visit China when China and the United States had just opened their bilateral ties. He went to Beijing, Xi'an, Qingdao, and finally Shanghai. That was the first time he came back. He went back to 59 Zhoushan Road and found everything very familiar.
I took all my colleagues from the National Committee on a walk. We walked around and we looked at all the old places. I showed them where I had grown up, where I had gone to school, where I lived, and so forth. So that was my first visit. Physically, it looked like the way I remembered it. Not many, some buildings in the Russian style on Nanjing Shilu, you know, which used to be called Qing'ezelu, was a different name. There was a big building that had been built that looked like a Russian building in Moscow. A few buildings like that, but basically no rickshaws, no wampatsos. Rickshaws were gone, lots of bicycles, very few cars. See, hard for you to imagine now that you've got traffic jams in Shanghai. Very few cars.
He said that although he's 90 now, he still wants to bring his wife with him to revisit the place where he used to live. While Blumenthal was visiting Shanghai, Sonia, who's now in Germany, was also expecting a long-awaited reunion.
They will arrive, no problem at all.
You have waited for 70 years.
For 70 years, right.
So the 5 minutes is just...
it's like nothing.
Like nothing.
Like nothing, yes.
In 1946, 7-year-old Sonia and her brother Peter took this picture in Shanghai. The other 2 girls in the picture were the twin sisters from the Bayer family. After the victory in the war, the 4 childhood friends became separated. Today is their first reunion in 70 years.
You were gefallen. I told him you are short as I am.
Yeah. Can you get down that far?
Hey, Peter. I'm in your arms. So, time is much better than it was.
1, 2, 3,
you know. Okay.
1, 2, 3, go!
Time froze at this moment, as if it were 70 years ago.
Anyway, you make a very long rope, and then one person holds it on that side, and one person holds it,
and then
you
raise it higher, and you jump,
and then it goes up.
Isendago yaseningo eyo hakado aro baro nipponkai aidai shai.
Remembering their childhood in Shanghai, they started to sing a nursery rhyme, just as they had 70 years ago. 70 years have passed since the end of the war. Driven by an invisible force, people around the world look back at history in their own ways.
Ich möchte jetzt ein großartiges Projekt zeigen. Ach, da ist ja einer, ein Stolperstein. Es gibt verschiedene Orte, zum Beispiel jetzt hier in der Gegend muss sie gewohnt haben, da man für sie hier diesen Stolperstein gelegt hat. Es ist ein fantastisches Projekt, um an Menschen zu erinnern, an Nachbarn zu erinnern.
On the streets of Berlin, these protruding stones are everywhere. Each stone has a bronze plate with the name of a Jewish victim who was killed or deported by the Nazis. These stones are to remind people of what happened in this country and of those who suffered here.
If you save one life, you save the world.